to be joined by a distinct group of panelists who will definitely offer us distinct perspectives on the topic of practicing civility in political conversations. I wanted to start out quickly with a quotation from a 2018 report called Hidden Tribes by the group More in Common. The quote says, "The polarization that was once seen mostly among talking heads on cable television has made its way into local communities, Facebook feeds, and to the Thanksgiving dinner table. Shifting the tone of public debate so that citizens can freely communicate across the lines dividing them will be essential if Americans are going to address the immense issues confronting them." Today, we want to discuss how, in this highly polarized political environment, people with different ideas and ideologies can come together to address issues, and how civility plays into that process. We're going to begin with a panel discussion, but then we're going to switch gears and engage the audience in a workshop led by Dr. Samantha Ball. So without further ado, I want to introduce the panelists. Let's start with you, Derek, since you're right next to me. Derek Monson began the Sutherland Institute in 2007 as a policy analyst. He now leads Sutherland's policy team, which includes overseeing policy publications, event content, legislative efforts, research, and strategic policy initiatives. He has influenced a variety of public policy issues in Utah, including economic development and regulation, tax and budget, government transparency, public education, religious freedom, Medicaid reform, alcohol regulation, and immigration. His research has been published in public budgeting and finance, and he has provided expert policy analysis and commentary for the LA Times, HuffPost, The Hill, Washington Examiner, Associated Press, The Federalist, KSL and Deseret News, ABC4 Utah, Fox 13 Utah, WalletHub.com, UtahPolicy.com, the Salt Lake Tribune, and the Utah State Legislature. He has a bachelor's degrees in economics and political sciences from BYU, and a master's degree in finance from the University of Utah. Next to Derek is Shannon McGregor. Dr. McGregor is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah. Her research addresses the role of social media and their data in political processes with a focus on political communication, journalism, public opinion, and gender. Her published work examines how three groups, political actors, the press, and the public, use social media in regards to politics, how that social media use impacts their behavior, and how the policies and actions of social media companies in turn impacts political communication on their sites. Her work has been published in the Journal of Communication, New Media and Society, Political Communication, Journalism, and Information Communication and Society, and she co-edited a book called Digital Discussions, How Big Data Informs Political Communication. Finally, we have Rebecca Chavez-Hauk. Rebecca holds a BA in Journalism and Mass Communication and a Master of Public Administration, both from the University of Utah. She represented Salt Lake City's District 24 in the Utah House of Representatives from 2008 to 2018, focusing primarily on policy related to health and human services and voter engagement and access. Her leadership appointments included House Minority Whip and House Minority Assistant Whip. She now provides leadership coaching and community engagement consulting through her public affairs firm, Aspira Public Affairs. Did I pronounce that right? And also serves as the executive director for Utahns for Responsive Government, also known as Better Boundaries. She is the 2012 Council of State Government Tolles Fellows graduate. Rebecca was a public affairs staffer for a number of local Utah nonprofits from 1985 to 2007 and cultivated a parallel career as a volunteer for nonprofits ranging from Envision Utah, the ACLU, and Planned Parenthood Association of Utah. She continues to serve on myriad boards and initiatives and has been honored extensively for her efforts. Rebecca teaches nonprofit administration classes as adjunct faculty for the University of Utah's MPA program. So I want to thank each of you experiences and approaches the subject of civility in the work that you do. I'm going to give you this. This one right here. Maybe we can start with you, Derek.
Glad to be here. Thanks everybody for coming. So, our approach to civility, me personally as a Civil Institute is, I don't know, maybe it might turn out to be a unique one, we'll see what the other panelists have to say, but to illustrate and think about this question, if I told you, came to you and said, and maybe you're a friend of mine, you asked, hey, how's things going with you and your wife, how's your marriage going? I said, well, we're civil towards each other. What are the likelihood that that's a good marriage going on? Not high, right? So, now that's not to say civility is not a good thing. It's just to say that for the way I look at it, civility is not ultimately what we're shooting for. That's where we may end up. But what we're really shooting for is something. But, so for us, maybe civility is something that allows us to exist and get along in a free society, in peace, when we don't always hit maybe that ideal of having love for your neighbor, or again having a unity across a difference, or a true understanding of someone who thinks differently. And it's what allows us to then continue on even if we don't have that. So it's a good thing, but it's kind of aim for the stars and hit the trees or something, right? That's the trees. But because the reason I think that's important is if we end up aiming for civility as our end goal, because again we're in and so when we fall short in a way that is not so good.
So because I researched the way that people talk about politics on social media, civility might be the high bar in our most perfect world. So in thinking about the ways that I experience or approach civility or incivility, because I look at way people, politicians, the press use social media sort of in their political purposes, see a lot of incivility. And that might be the nicest word that we could come up with for a lot of what I examine in my research. But what I want to look at is not just what we as individuals do, but how do institutions and people who are in positions of power encourage things like civility, or even beyond something like that, something like understanding and unity. And so what role do they play in all of this? Because as sort of regular folks, and I'll put myself in that category, even though I'm up here with a microphone, we don't necessarily have as much power as people like politicians, as people like national journalists, and even in my space when I look at social media, the companies themselves, in order to shape sort of what sorts of speech is encouraged and what sort of speech is not encouraged across different platforms. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is how different policies, but also structures of social media companies and social media platforms may. It seems like it would not be a controversial conclusion to say, right now, maybe do not encourage civility even. And so what can be changed so that people can find, instead of finding disagreement, can find agreement, and instead of finding, anger, they can find, something different in these spaces. So I may think about civility as the high mark, not because that's what I think of, but that might be where we have to start in social media places. Although I agree that, in general, we can aim a lot higher, but we're starting with a pretty low bar when we think about the intersection of politics and social media, unfortunately.
So I'm going to share a couple of examples of how I connected with my constituents when I was serving in office to kind of set the stage for the way I view interacting with individuals who may not necessarily agree with me or see policy in the same way that I do. As a representative, you're representing somewhere around 36,000 people. If you're a senator in the state, you're representing 100,000 people. So the people that you hear from in terms of either phone calls or emails or concerns are very, 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 very small percentage of the people that you actually represent. That's a foundation. Just kind of put that over here, put that in the parking lot, just kind of in terms of context. As a legislator, I found the most helpful thing for me in terms of understanding the concerns of my constituency were the emails and phone calls, of course, but what I felt that I was connecting more deeply with my constituents, really understanding what they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis and how that interfaced with the area of government within which I work, was either when I was canvassing my district to talk to constituents door to door, when I was running for office, and or when I would go to community council meetings. In Salt Lake City, we really have a really strong program of community councils where people in neighborhoods have a community council, and as a legislator or as a member of the city council or somebody from the county government, you would go on a monthly basis to hear what people had to say, hear what's going on in the community, and also give a report as to the issues that you're working on. When I walk into a community council meeting, it's probably like this, where there's probably about as many people in a community council as are here today in this gathering. And when I walk in the room, I don't know if you're a conservative or a liberal. I don't know what your background is. I don't know when I walk into that space why you're there at that community council meeting. Maybe you come to hear about a new proposal that the city is moving forward, new policy. Maybe you have a complaint about a new development that's happening in your neighborhood, or somebody's putting a fence up. Maybe we're discussing dogs and off-leash areas, which I will tell you in a city discussion is pretty hot. If you want to talk about politics, talk about dog off-leash policy. It sounds really obscure, but people feel very strongly on both sides of the issue on that particular issue. But when I walk into the room, I just see a group of constituents. I see a group of people that are gathering to give feedback to people that represent them about those concerns. And so when I see them face to face, whether it's at the doorstep or it's in the convening of a community council, there is an opportunity for the vitriol or a sense of heightened angst about an issue to diffuse itself. Because when I'm talking to you about your concerns, and it's not an email and it's not a phone call, I can see you. I can ascertain from the way you're engaging with me how passionately you feel about this issue, if it's something that you just need to hear about. Maybe you just need somebody to talk to you about the issue. I might be able to, as a legislator or as an elected official, turn to you and then say, you know what, I don't know how much I can do about that, but I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. Let's see if we can find you a solution, or let's see how we can talk to the other side a bit more in a space where you feel like you're being heard, they're feeling like they're being heard. But I always appreciated the one-on-ones, or being in a space where I could be with people to have those conversations versus email or phone calling, because then I could really ascertain from the body language where people were coming from. I could mirror it in terms of my ability to empathize with them, or to say, okay, can I present another alternative point of view that you might want to consider, or understand that I'm trying to hear that from another side. But I'm a very, very strong believer. As much as I like communicating with people via email just to get an understanding of where they're coming from, of when trying to solve something, to be in communication one-on-one, to be in front of that person so that they and I can really connect about what they're concerned about. So I think that is one of those bridges to civility, is more community engagement, more community discussion versus just doing it on email, versus just doing it on social media. Otherwise, you're not really connecting and being in a relationship with another human being, which is what community and I think our country is all about.
Thank you. I wonder if you guys, each of you, can give some examples of when civility really mattered on an issue you were working on, either to advance that issue or to stall progress that you thought was originally conceivable. Are there any specific issues where civility made an impact? Sure, doesn't matter. Whoever wants to dive in.
Yeah.
I think there are a couple. So at Sutherland, right, we kind of weigh in on a host of issues, some more controversial, some less so, some more emotional, some more based on logic and data and analysis, that kind of thing. And one area that is more controversial, emotional, and difficult is the area of religious liberty and at the intersection with LGBTQ equality. And there was, this is years ago now, there was an individual who, she is a lesbian reverend, works for an organization that tries to help gay and lesbian individuals who want to maintain a particular religious faith, whatever faith that may be, and navigate their sexual orientation and reconcile those two things. And she had, I came to find out later, basically stalked me through our organization's website and was interested in having a conversation. And so she reached out to a mutual colleague who reached out to me, and we set up a meeting. And that has actually led to a years-long now partnership of we write and speak at events together, oftentimes trying to persuade people there's a better way to navigate these issues that are in conflict than simply choosing one side and trying to defeat the other side. Because frankly, there doesn't need to be sides to this. We can actually protect everybody, believe it or not. Anyway, that's a little beside the point, but that conversation began with civility. So basically, I should amend my response to the first question that, civility is in some ways a starting point to healthy relationships, partnerships, human interactions, particularly if you don't know someone, beyond maybe knowing that there are some differences between the two of you. And that was a particular instance where that's where it had to start. If it didn't start there, that would probably be the only time we interacted with her. And I'm glad it wasn't that way because it's one of the more, I guess, valuable professional relationships that I've had in my about 13 years at Civil Institute. And that was all made possible to begin with by looking at someone and trying to start from this baseline of civility and then see if we can build towards unity across difference from there. In this case, that worked out. It doesn't always do that, but so that's, I think, what I've seen it play out in a very healthy and beneficial way for me.
So to kind of spin off from what I was talking about, having conversations with constituents, because what I don't want civility to be confused with is passion and care and feeling strongly about either being wronged as a community or being wronged as an individual, and invalidating that those feelings are valid. That sometimes people have been wronged either as a community because of systemic issues that our country and our society has put upon certain segments of the community, or individually. Many people have been wronged in many ways by their government, by people in their community. And as elected officials, it was our job to try to find a space where people felt that they could be protected by people in power. And so, part of it is, people would often come to me very either upset or angry. And I didn't want them to feel that being a conversation with me that they necessarily had to placate me or sugarcoat is the word that I'm thinking. Their extreme frustration and umbrage. However, the other side of it is, if you've ever encountered any relationship, a parent, a sibling, a friend, a partner, and you enter in a conversation with them in a spirit of being angry, you know that the other person is either going to mirror that and it's going to escalate, or someone has an opportunity to de-escalate the fury and get to what the person needs to solve the concern or the umbrage or whatever it is that they need fixed. I often, when I speak to individuals who are working in the space of trying to solve community problems and they're working with a constituent group, I always talk about the distinction between finding out what a person wants versus what a person needs. Now, what a person wants is valuable. They are angry. They want fix. They want something. but what they may need may not be the thing that they asked for in the first place, especially when you're looking at the public policy forum. Sometimes there can be a fix to remedy what they feel has hurt them, but that might not be what they originally wanted. They may not know what the solution is, and that's what our job is oftentimes as public officials, is to see what do we have influence on, where can we change things that can really fix what it is that this person needs. And at the same time, they get what they want, but sometimes they're two different distinct things. So I guess, I've got tons of examples. That's why I was having such a hard time to try to pick one. But at the end of the day, it is a lot about validating the pain and anger somebody may feel about something, trying to get to solution by mirroring back at them a sense of de-escalating what could turn into, just this going back and forth, either rhetorically or in a space of anger. So I'm not going to mirror back anger at somebody who is angry at me or at the system. I'm going to listen to what they have to say, value what they have to say, and see if we can take it to the next step to try to find a solution.
I think the process you're describing is really important and so hard to do, sometimes for people. And I think especially when we think about how we interact with information and where we get political information. There's a new report that Pew released today that found that about half of Americans get their news on social media, and about a third of Americans get their news they say often. They often get their news on social media. But at the same time, over a third of Americans say that uncivil discussions about the news are a very big problem when it comes to news on social media. So we're going there to get our news, but we have this feeling that it's not a great place to go get news, because I think this process that you're describing, when someone comes to you in anger, or when you open Facebook or you open Twitter and you see something angry, or you see something that offends you, and it's okay to be offended by that. There's a lot of offensive stuff on social media. Our first reaction is responsive to that, right? It's anger. It's to offend back. And the platforms encourage that, right? It's about immediacy. It's about speed. So it encourages that initial reaction. And instead, even if we don't go through this more advanced process, if we just take literally a second and stop, oftentimes that can help us to not have that emotive, I don't even want to say emotive, because I think it's okay to be, I sort of hate the word emotional like it's a bad thing, right? Emotionality is good. I can be mad or angry or happy about something, and that can be really positive from a civic participation standpoint. But if we want to not continue this sort of spiral of incivility and of sort of anger that's not fruitful, that just is personal and that is not, sort of solving things, we need to sort of come to a place where we can slow down for a second sometimes. Although, of course, that's sort of on purpose hard on social media, right? The ethos of many of these tech companies has been to move fast and break things, right? And whoo, have they ever? And so instead, I've asked them to sort of slow down and fix things. But I think, until and if that ever happens, the onus can sometimes be on us instead to do that, and even to provide a reaction in a different space. So I got involved in politics because my mom is super political. My dad's was a journalist. I basically didn't have a choice, right? I guess I could have rebelled and been I don't care about politics, but that didn't last. So I sort of come to this naturally. But my mom is super political on Facebook, super political, and I love it. She's 76 years old and still registering people for, to vote, and it's awesome. But sometimes, even though she's a super smart and committed, person in politics, she says stuff that is either just wrong, factually, or I think how can you be sort of attacking other people like this? And my instinct as sort of her daughter is to be hold on, and I want to reply to her Facebook comment. But what I've started doing instead, and mostly in cases when it's just false, because if I take a breath, I think whatever, I don't really care if my mom's mad about something, it doesn't impact me that much, you know what I mean? She lives in Florida. But when I see that something's wrong, instead of responding on there and saying hey, you're wrong, this is false information, and this could be really upsetting and damaging to people, Instead, I like screenshot it and I text her. And I find that that is a much nicer way to interact, right? I'm not calling her out in front of other people. I'm not continuing this. I'm just saying, like, hey, like, maybe you don't know this. And you know, I do, because I kind of get paid to know this stuff. You know what I mean? That this is not great information. I can totally understand why you think it was. You know, so just that pause, like in my own life, I have found my reactions sort of come down a level. And I think as a way to interact more civilly. But that's really hard to do sometimes on social media, which is a place where, you know, for better or for worse, a lot of political and news information, you know, is taking place. And so, you know, it is difficult to act, I think, civilly sometimes on social media, sort of on purpose. But I think, you know, until the tech companies do something about fixing that, I think, you know, unfortunately the onus is on us to sort of do that ourselves and slow down and hopefully set an example, you know, for other folks and stop the cascading of anger, I think, that can happen sometimes.
Thank you. You've alluded to some interesting ideas here. Derek, you alluded to the idea that you may not know someone right away, and civility helps you get to know them. And Rebecca, that a lot of instability can sometimes come from emotions, right, from feelings, or Shannon, from misinformation. Let's talk a little bit about empathy for a minute. Connor Friesdorf, who wrote an article in The Atlantic in 2017 entitled "How People Like You Fuel Extremism," suggests that discussing politics with only similarly minded people can stoke polarization and extremism. And the study that I referred to earlier, called Hidden Tribes, was published by More in Common in October of 2018, showed that although 77% of Americans believe that our differences are not so great that we cannot come together, most Americans actually censor themselves on sensitive political topics, and except among people they regard as like-minded. The quote from the report is, "If we are able to overcome the polarization between opposing groups, greater empathy for the other side is required." My question to you is, why is empathy important? Who wants to tackle it?
I can start. Empathy is important because it's about understanding, right? It's about being open to understanding where someone else is coming from. That can be really hard sometimes, right? When someone is saying something that is fundamentally opposed to what you believe or may even offend you. But I think sort of like Rebecca was mentioning, sometimes it's getting to the root of what is that, you know what I mean? That sometimes the offensive idea or abhorrent statement even may be rooted in some other feeling that may be more addressable or maybe something that you can find empathy for. And so I think that, you know, the idea of understanding is important. You know, and in these studies you mentioned, you know, they talk about polarization and sort of only talking with people who are like you. Certainly people are becoming silent, you know, publicly about political things. And I don't want to finger away the people for that. There are people, you know, the ability to speak publicly about your politics is a really privileged place to be in, right? There are some people who might feel physically unsafe to do that. I have a colleague from grad school who researched her dissertation, a group of women in rural Texas who were liberal and felt physically unsafe to express those views in their own homes, in their community. They met secretly to have other people to talk about this, like literally in like an abandoned barn on someone's property, you know? So while I do believe, you know, from a normative perspective that it's really important to share our political views, I don't want to get into a situation where we're finger waving at people for not doing that. On the other hand, I think we do need to try and come to a place where we're not censoring ourselves, because when we do, we're ceding our political positions to the loudest voices in the room, which tend to be the more extreme, whichever side of the political aisle you're on. And when we do that, that just furthers this idea of polarization, which I think makes it then even less likely for you to have empathy for someone, right? If we're just dealing with extremes on one side and extremes on the other side, then that makes the idea of empathy and understanding less and less possible. And so, you know, to the extent that we do feel safe to express our political opinions, moderate or, you know, not crazy as they may be, I would hope that we can do that, because I think that that can lead to more understanding, and that then we can have empathy for people. But I do definitely want to recognize the sort of privilege that comes with that, with the ability to do that. And because I'm a social scientist, I just want to mention this one thing that I think was interesting. Some friends did a study recently where they looked at when Twitter went from 140 characters to 280 characters, and they were looking at civility. And they found that actually the longer tweets led to more civility. People were more likely to be civil, they were substantiating their arguments, and this was around politics. So cool, right? But they also found that when people used those extra characters, they used them to argue their side. They did not use those extra characters to respect other opinions, to engage in any empathy for positions on another side of politics. So civility and empathy are not necessarily always co-occurring phenomenons, right? We can be civil, we can be polite, but we cannot be open, right, to understanding or empathy. And I think that's an important tension to keep in mind as well.
So the ability to be empathetic, I feel, has sometimes been a real challenge for me. Not that I can't do it, it's that I do it almost as a fault. When I'm having a conversation with a constituent or with somebody and they're telling me about a problem, I really do feel it deeply. And it caused some challenges for me as a legislator sometimes, because you want to present a sense of being able to hear both sides and to be in a space of understanding what's going on both sides. But there were a lot of times that I would go to my office after committee meetings and just cry, because what people were saying so deeply from how policy affected them really did hit me in the gut. Serving 9 years on the Social Services Appropriations Committee during the recession will take that out of any of you. I mean, it is just heartbreaking to kind of hear how people are experiencing their world and the things that we do in government that either help or hinder them from living a good quality life. So, empathy, I think, is really, really important, but I also think that that it can wear on people if you don't really balance it in your ability to be able to interface with people and assess how you as an individual are not keeping yourself separate from what the issue is. So it's just, I found it to be oftentimes a very challenging tightrope to walk on, to be empathetic, to care, but not get so pulled into it that it really consumed me. It's very easy to be consumed by an issue when you see people being hurt or harmed, or you realize that something needs to be fixed. But then that's when you have to kind of redirect your energy and that striving for fixing something into really working at solutions and looking at operations or policies or whatever needs to be done, the negotiations that need to be made with the other side to be able to get to a solution. But empathy is important so that you can really see how people are experiencing, how they connect with their government or other community structures through their own eyes. You have to be able to be empathetic.
Yeah, I agree entirely with what Shannon said about empathy is a critical component to understanding. In working where I work, I started to think about what that means for communities and society. And what that means is we need empathy in order to be able to it's a necessary component of living peacefully in a free society where there are going to be different kinds of people who maybe they're different how they think, maybe they're different how they look, maybe they have different cultural background, ethnic background, whatever it is. There's lots of differences out there. And maybe highlighting directly into the question of why it's important is to look at what happens when we lose it. I think you see this a lot on the national level. It wasn't that long ago, in terms of years or decades perhaps, that people on different partisan beliefs, affiliations, despite the different passionate differences in how they thought and believed, in their values, in their policy outlooks, they were able to get together and solve problems. They were able to pass legislation. And, sometimes it was, one party controlled Congress and the Senate, and one party controlled the White House. Sometimes it was, one party controlled Congress, the other controlled the Senate and the White House. But we were able to do stuff. And when you hear interviews of congressmen and U.S. senators, oftentimes they say, some of the things that allowed those kinds of interactions to happen was how they interacted on a personal level outside of the policy-making space, such that they might not necessarily express it in these terms, but they gained an understanding, an empathy for people on a human level. That, and they learned oftentimes we all have common goals that we're trying to go after, even if we have different partisan beliefs, different policy beliefs, or different ideologies. And increasingly, it's kind of politically verboten to even interact socially with someone of a different partisan stripe, right? Maybe a more recent example, and I'm not commenting on, I'll say that in a minute, but when Vice President Biden talked about working with segregationists, right, back decades ago, which at that time, the political reality is that was necessary to actually accomplish things. Now, I'm not commenting on segregation and the merits, I'm not any of that. But what I am commenting on is when that came out, I got so much backlash for being openly talking about working with people who held these repugnant views. And what does that say to any politician looking at that? That says, I better not interact with the wrong people. And the wrong people are going to be people who have different partisan views than you, different cultural views than you. And it turns out just that we have different cultural views. And so if we're not willing to work with each other because of those things break down. And so again, if we're not willing to dissociate at any level, you lose that understanding. And also what then happens is the people who are different, say different partisan view or different ideological view, now they're not just your opponent or someone who thinks of it, they're your enemy. Because you don't even see them as really a true human being anymore. Because there's no understanding, there's no empathy that connects you to that person and says, oh, their family and what the love they share and the things they're going for in their life are just like mine. No, they're actually just terrible human beings. Maybe they're lacking in rationality, maybe they're lacking in character, morality. There's something either evil or stupid, right? They're not really human beings, just like human beings. And that's kind of what happens when we lose that empathy and that understanding, when we see it playing out in spades at the federal level. But even in some cases, it's creeping into the state level, disturbingly. And the hard part, again, of this, maybe this is implied in what I just said, is that you have to have empathy not just for people who are your friends naturally, or who you naturally have an affinity with, because you have similarities. You have to have and create empathy for people who think completely different than you. And in some cases, you might think that their views are repugnant. But you still have common goals. Again, I'll go back to the example of differences on what you think about religious liberty and LGBTQ issues, gay rights. That's an issue where the people who are on different sides see the other as morally repugnant. In both cases, going both directions. And that's where empathy is the most needed, and it's the hardest. And so I guess what I'm saying is, it's easy to say all this stuff. It's more difficult to then go and actually put it into practice. And it can be scary because, if your view of the world is one where there's, people who have a certain belief are just evil, but then you interact on a personal level with them and find that there's commonalities, well, that's just, the whole comfort zone of evil and good is gone now. Now, you might still think some of their views are repugnant or whatever, but you also recognize, you see some of yourself in them. What does that mean for your worldview now? You got to change all of that. You got to rethink all of that. And that can be a scary proposition, especially if you're talking about deeply held beliefs about politics and policy. So it's easy to say, very hard to do, but critically important if we actually want to do the things that we all talk about doing, protecting people, helping people thrive in their lives. Because when all this breaks down, nothing gets done, no matter what side we're on. And so whichever side you're on, you end up failing. And the things you say you are opposed to the most continue. And that's just kind of sad.
We certainly wouldn't be talking about civility today if it was very easy.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of challenges to civility. Let's talk about those people who are angry or emotional about the issues. Is it possible to have a civil conversation if you're angry or upset about an issue? And as a corollary, is it possible to be honest and frank and also civil?
That's a kickoff. Yeah, it's definitely possible. You're right. I mean, civility does not mean you can't be passionate. But I will say, there's a difference between being passionate and being angry. And it's kind of a learned thing in my experience. So you can have a passionate conversation and not, say, personally insult someone, or demean someone's intelligence or dignity or those kinds of things. But the human reality is, as we try to figure out how to be passionate without crossing boundaries, you're probably going to cross boundaries at times. And so it's possible, but what's required is a willingness to engage in that. Going back to some of the things about people censor themselves, right? We need to be able to actually have candid conversations. But from the other side, the person who's hearing the person being candid and frank needs to have a little bit of just a willingness to let people make mistakes without then ending a conversation. It doesn't mean you don't say anything about it. Like if you got insulted, you say, "Hey, that was kind of insulting." But we have to be able to help. You have to let each other learn, I guess is what I'm saying. And still have relationships afterwards. And that's something that maybe isn't happening as much as it needs to today.
I absolutely feel that emotionality can coexist with civility, right? And I think emotionality is important. Like, I want everyone to participate in politics. So that's just like a thing that I believe in. And oftentimes that means you have to feel personally invested and emotional about something in order to get you out the door, to talk to people about it, to vote, whatever it is. And I worry sometimes, we haven't talked about this up here today, but like, how do we define civility and what is civility? From the academic side, there are a whole range of different definitions and the way that we measure it and the way that we talk about it. But from the way it's been used in the public sphere, like absolutely civility has been and sometimes still is used in this country as a weapon to silence minority voices, right? The civil rights workers in the 60s were called uncivil, for doing what they were doing. So this, is a term that we can talk about as a thing that we all value, but it is also a thing that we have to be careful about how we define it and how we use it, because it has been sort of used to silence people, absolutely. And so I actually have some academic colleagues, not from here, but from other universities, who were last week at a gathering of the National Institute for Civic Discourse. So I called one of them who was there and I said, "Hey, what were you guys talking about just this weekend? Because I'm going to be on this panel about civility." And she said, in this moment, a sort of, for many people, I think a crisis in our country, they were talking about redefining the issues of civility in terms of like respect and tolerance, and it's not necessarily about being polite, or not being emotional, but about having some respect for other people having an opinion. You might not even respect their opinion. There are a lot of opinions that I have no respect for, but I can respect the people having those opinions, right, as humans. And talking and thinking about, which Jared brought up earlier, if we think about the norms and what we want in a liberal democracy, I don't mean liberal politically, I just, mean the term liberal democracy, this requires that we have a diversity of viewpoints. That means there will be disagreements. This is a thing that we want. This is how it all works, is that we have disagreements. So I absolutely think you can be emotional and be civil, and it's about not only respecting other people's emotionality, but them respecting yours. There have been times in my life politically where I have been sad, where I've been worse than angry. I've been enraged, you know? And maybe for me, I think these are not the moments where I'm going to talk to anyone else, right? And I'm just going to deal with it for a little bit, or talk to people that I know, or, you know, are close enough to me that they're not going to throw away my relationship if I say a curse word, you know, or cry or scream about something. And so I think, you know, we can think about when we might be able to have productive conversations with other people, and we can be sensitive to when other people may feel so affected by something that they can't be civil, and be okay with that, you know, and like you mentioned, go back to them sort of as a human, even if we may not disagree with their particular viewpoints. We may not agree with their viewpoints, or we may deeply disagree with their viewpoints, but we can understand them as humans, and we can maybe have some grace and forgive them some lapses in civility to try and keep our conversation moving for the sake of things like, you know, having a functioning democracy, which I think is a good thing.
So I'm going to dovetail into your comments related to the issue of I think all actions serve a purpose. So there are times where, you know, people will engage in civil unrest, in rallying, in protesting. That oftentimes will say, well, why are they doing that? They're destroying something. They're doing this. It makes us very uncomfortable when we see people protesting as a community or whatever. And there have been times for people that feel very strongly that are participating in this civil unrest will turn to someone like me and say, you should come out and, you know, be with us, and I certainly support them. But the way I look at it is they are all tools in a toolbox that I think need to be utilized at different reasons, and they put their pressure points on making change in our community. Sometimes it takes people really being angry about something and being visually angry about something for the community to realize that there has a friend has occurred, that somebody has been harmed. I mean, we could talk about it academically, we could talk about it theoretically, we could talk about it in safe spaces, but sometimes people don't hear it unless there's civil unrest and people say, hey, this needs to change. So on the other hand, though, we can have all of that, but if we just have that more form of protest but not have action within the policy sphere, then things also don't change. So I think you need all of it. My belief is sometimes that those protests, that action lights the fire and brings awareness to the broader community that may not be there. People just may not know about some of these issues with Black Lives Matter or some of these other concerns. They just maybe never thought about it and don't really see it until somebody really just kind of does a flashpoint and say, this is happening, you need to listen. But on the other hand, okay, so what is the solution? And I always talk to team members whenever I'm working on policy or something. I used to do this when I was in leadership in the House, and they would say, well, we want to take a stand on this particular bill or whatever, and I would say, so what's our end game? What's the goal? What do we want to happen? We can talk about it, we can be angry about it. That brings us to a certain level in coming to a solution. But what's our end game? If what we decide to do is a caucus, by taking a statement, by doing a press conference, by doing whatever, doesn't get us to that end goal, which is a fix, then have we done what we were trying to aim to do? So I would always say, okay, I'm fine for being angry or making a statement or whatever we need to do, but then I want to know, what is it going to lead to? What is it going to be? How is it going to solve the problem? So I like to bring up, I'm just so glad you mentioned what you did, because, you know, I think there's space for all of it. I think there's space for being able to have what might be seen as a more civic dialogue or a civil dialogue, but I also think that there's totally room for civil unrest and for people to be able to bring their concerns to the forefront in a very public way. There are countries where that can't happen. And I always remind people there are countries where that can't happen. And when we have that ability to be able to protest, we should afford the people to do that, the opportunity to do that, because it often drives the dialogue of, okay, this is a problem in our community. What are we going to do to solve it together? And then convening those conversations, but listening to both sides on the aisle or across the table is very important. Ancillary to that, I'll be brief on this too, as a legislator, we were taught very early on that, and this is something I also learned very early on, that you just can't burn bridges either. A legislator with whom I may disagree on one particular issue or one bill one time may be my strongest ally on another issue that I desperately needed the support from the Republican side of the aisle. And I needed a navigator. I needed somebody as an ambassador to take my bill or my proposal to the Republicans and say, look, this is why I, the Republican, feel strongly that we need to support Representative Chavez Hough's bill, because this thing happened to my family, or this happened in my community. She has a great solution. We're working together to come up with that solution. Now, on another issue, he or she and I might be total opposites on this. And we would know that that's just the way things work. And I would always tell my colleagues, you have to, and often my constituents, that we focus on policy, not persons. We're not attacking the person, we're attacking the policy, or we're bringing concerns, or bringing information that might be the discussion regarding what that policy is. I am not attacking the person for who they are.
Thank you. I have about 1,000 more questions for you, but I am going to take the last few minutes of the panel time to offer up to the audience to ask your questions of these great speakers. Does anybody have anything to ask?
I'm Jack. You mentioned social media platforms being able to make changes in their structure, their platform, in order to increase civility. Do you mind sharing some of those ideas and how to do it?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so one, although I don't think that was their design, it turns out sort of by accident, Twitter, despite what we may see amplified beyond Twitter and the news, Twitter became a more civil space for politics when they extended the character limit, so then we can, and people in my field have done research that, suggests that like when say there's a public Facebook page, most politicians, right, have a public Facebook page, and the debate in some of the comments can get a little uncivil, to call it mildly sometimes, right? But we know from research that if there's a moderator, just the known presence that there's a moderator means people will be more uncivil, right? So making changes to allow that to be a thing that happens, or make it to be a banner, that says on a page that says, this page is moderated. We know that just that little cue can make people behave more civilly. And there can also be structural things about, things like how long can the comments be, how many times can you reply to something, can you flag something as uncivil or not? At first we thought, oh, that might be great. Duh, it turns out you can really weaponize that, right? And I can just say something is uncivil, or we saw this with Facebook and, misinformation. I just don't agree with something, so I can flag it as fake news, and then it gets reviewed, and it's this whole thing, So there are some things that we know work, and there are some things that we know don't work. But in general, I think we're at this moment right now where a lot of these tech companies and social media companies, they really don't want to be in the business of regulating political speech, but they are, right? They are very much at the center of this, especially in the face of complete political gridlock from Washington and regulatory bodies that we might examine, that we might initially turn to for something like this, like the FEC and the FCC. So we're in this really unfortunate situation of actually relying on people who are working at these private for-profit companies to make decisions that we hope will be pro-social and help encourage things maybe like civility, or even, maybe even a much lower bar, just like not hate speech, right? But that's not necessarily in their best interest from a bottom line perspective. So, folks in my world can do experiments and we can test different things that might work, but there's not necessarily a lot of will within those companies to make that happen. But I will say, what we do know so far is public pressure works. When we see that the public, or people who represent the public, come out and say something about particular decisions, or even bigger level things with these social media companies, that they are responsive to that. So I would say, be public about it. If you're seeing something that's happening or you don't agree with the decision, be public about it, call your representatives about it, especially people who might have some oversight regulation, on these companies, to be public about it, because we do know that so far has worked in some cases.
We are going to switch to the workshop in just a moment, so we'll have time for one more question.
So I just kind of was sitting here and thinking about how a lot of this conversation, by nature and the reality of the moment, has been rather depressing, perhaps. A lot of negative outlook, right, on the future. And what reminded me of is, as you were talking about social media, is that, you know, the reality of all this stuff in politics in particular is we've been here before. This is not new. If you think things are uncivil today, in political conversation, go back to the initial presidencies of the United States and the partisan media outlets that they didn't have any of the norms we have today, that some were falling away, but they didn't even have that. And just kind of attacking people, and, well, I won't go into the details, but the point is, that didn't destroy our democracy. And it's a different moment today than back then, right? So I'm not just going to say, therefore, we're all good. But I think oftentimes we get so worried about today that we don't realize that, you know, our democracy has always been at peril because every generation has to learn how to interact in it. And so, and you know, in particular context of social media, I heard someone talk about how back when the telephone was first invented or started to gain mass use, there was a lot of concern as to how it was being used and how it was disrupting society. It was going to lead to all amount of horrors and nightmares. But we learned how to use it. We figured it out. And some of that is some of the stuff that, like Shannon talked about, like the telephone companies or perhaps laws and regulations. But a lot of it, too, was just people over time realized this is not the best use, or this is a good use of this particular communication, form of communication. And social media just hasn't been around that long, if you really think about it. Maybe Twitter's been around for like 10 years, something like that. So, again, we've been here before, and we've come out okay. Of course, that requires effort from all of us, but I hope you don't take away from this conversation as just all depression. Because I think we are really going to figure it out, and things will get better over time as we learn as people and as companies and things like that.
Thank you. That's really great. Before we move on to our next speaker and the workshop, I really want to just extend a round of applause and thank you so much for all of this. You're welcome to stay for the workshop if you want to. We'd love to have you. In the meantime, I'd like to switch gears and introduce our next speaker, Dr. Samantha Ball. Dr. Ball is a research associate at the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute, where she provides research, analysis, facilitation, and instruction on a range of subjects, including deliberative, community engagement, and public policy. She's involved in advancing informed, nonpartisan public deliberation on policy issues through the Gardner Policy Institute's role as Kettering Foundation Center for Public Life, including a recent project involving 10 diverse deliberative groups of parents throughout the state discussing their experiences with early childhood education services. Her informed public deliberation work builds upon her published research on the potential impact of educational and deliberative forums on public opinion and policy making. Samantha holds a bachelor's in political science from UCLA, a master of public policy from Georgetown University, and a PhD in political science from the University of Utah. She has also served as an adjunct instructor in political science and public administration at the University of Utah. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Samantha Ball.
This was such a great, panel just now, and I really am struck by that there's no more important time for everyone to be talking with people who have different experiences and different values and ideas and positions than you do. So whether it's person-to-person or social media, or whether we're watching a news show, there's just a lot of adversarial interactions going on. And I think efforts like this one to try to engage more civilly and constructively and productively are really important. So I work at the Gardner Policy Institute. We do something called deliberative community engagement. We get together as diverse a group of people as we can. We provide them with a lot of good quality information as background, and we go over kind of the pros and cons associated with different ways forward. And then we provide them with the opportunity to talk together and work and see if they can find some common ground. So deliberations quite a bit different than something you might see at a town hall meeting in terms of involving people, where people are basically getting a minute to say the thing that is the most either maddening or exciting or sad to them that they can think of, and there's really no opportunity to engage with anybody that disagrees because the policy is pretty far down the pipeline. I think, let me just see if I can go to this next one. Deliberation is different than that because it's a thoughtful consideration of all the information that you can gather on an issue, and it recognizes that no matter which way forward that you pick on an issue, there's going to be pros and cons of that issue, of that approach. And it's a focus on what's most important to you, but also learning to understand what's important to the other people that are involved, and engaging in a sincere effort to understand their ideas and their perspective, and even be open to changing your point of view. So, so before we kind of do like a little mini civil exercise, civil workshop to test this out. But first I want to say a couple of things to keep in mind. One is just that these issues are hard. If they're a controversial issue, that means that it wasn't an easy fix, because if it was an easy fix, someone would have just done it and claimed credit and gone home, and that would be done. So these are all difficult issues, and they almost always involve values where people feel really strongly about something. And the surprising thing is that a lot of times they're values that we share. So even though you're thinking of this person as your opponent, you actually frequently share the values, you just prioritize them differently. So an example would be freedom, security, privacy. If I said some values like that, most people would probably think, yeah, those are good values. But if I outlined like a new major security endeavor at the airport, then people, depending on their prioritization of those values and their experience and what they thought they'd be doing at the airport in the next little while, they might differ a lot on whether or not they perceive that as a good idea. So this next one, some of these types of value trade-offs are even perceived as a wicked problem. And the idea of a wicked problem is that no matter what you do, it's going to be at the detriment of another value that you hold. So in this room, this is representing childcare as a wicked problem. In this room, no matter what your background is, if you've never had children, if you've never thought about childcare, or if you've been a childcare worker, almost no one is going to say that low quality, unsafe, inaccessible, high-cost childcare is where they want to get going on this issue. So everybody really actually agrees on these values, but in each case, if you wanted to do something like increase the quality of childcare, it will necessarily do something like also increase the cost. And so even when we have our own internal conversation about what we want here, it's difficult because the values are at odds with each other. So this next screen is just a list of 9 values: equality, security, community, justice, privacy, fiscal responsibility, conservation, freedom for ourselves, freedom for future generations. I'd like you to just take a moment to think which of these values you feel is the most important one. And once you think of it, I'd like you to just turn to anyone around you you don't have to get up and move around too much, but just tell them what your most important value is, and then also listen to what that person's most important value is. Okay, does anybody have, anybody want to share one of their conversations conversations what they found out from someone that was either surprising or where you really actually agreed or it was a good exchange. Or, Anybody want to share? Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if I. Makes me really laugh. We came to the conclusion that there's a lot of subjectivity with each one of those words. So how you define equality or freedom for ourselves or justice varies quite a bit. So in order to have a conversation that's going to actually result in something positive coming from the conversation, you have to start with the foundation of what each one of those words means first. So, just a thought.
I think that's a good one, and it makes it even more complicated.
Yeah.
There's paper and pen around. The next one is just a building on this one. To just really quickly, you can even do this on your laptop, or if you just want to raise your hand for pen and paper, take a few minutes just to rank these values. And now that you pointed out they're subjective, that's something to think about too. But from like the one that's most important to you and least important to you, and then share a little bit about that reasoning with the people next to you, and we'll check in one more time.